Hello and welcome to the Undressing the Spirit podcast, where sex and spirit go hand in hand. Join me, Tamara Powell, on a no-holds-barred adventure into the psyche and beyond every conceivable limit. Hey hot stuff, welcome back to Undressing the Spirit. I am so excited that you are here again with me. I don't know where you are out in the world today, but here in beautiful downtown sunny Pensacola, Florida, it is creeping up near 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're not even in March yet, at least as of this recording date. It's certainly been an unseasonably warm winter, hasn't it? Not that this former New England girl is complaining. I certainly do not miss shoveling all that snow during blizzards. I miss some of the culture of New England, but I am happy to trade in the snow for the sugar sand beaches of Florida. Speaking of hot things, today's topic is surrounding the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, also known as AASECT's recent historical position ruling regarding sexual addictions and porn addictions. And basically, AASECT came out and said that it did not find sufficient empirical evidence to support the classification of sex addiction or porn addiction as a mental health disorder. Now, you may be sitting here wondering, why is this a big deal? Well, my guest, Heather McPherson, is going to share more on why the rippling effects through the mental health community are quite stunning at this moment. More on my guest, Heather. Heather maintains a private practice in Austin, Texas, specializing in sexuality and relationships, right? So she's kind of my twin soul sister. In addition to being a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor supervisor, she is also a sex therapist. The biggest thing that I love about her is that Heather is the CEO and founder of the Sexual Health Alliance, which is the first and currently the only organization that facilitates progressive communication among sexual health professionals and all therapists through lectures, roundtables, and educational workshops. So without further ado, I give you Heather McPherson. Welcome, Heather, to the show. I'm so happy you're here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to talk about all things sex and alternative and just awesomeness, I guess.
Yes, pure awesomeness.
Tell my listeners how you got into this super cool field.
Well, I went to grad school at Texas State University and I got my master's in professional counseling and I did the dual track. So I did licensed professional counseling and licensed marriage and family therapy. And when I got out, I started a private practice and I started seeing couples and they started talking to me about sex.
Yes. So you didn't grow up thinking that's what you were going to do?
I grew up thinking I wanted to be a therapist.
Okay.
And it just kind of naturally, you know, our paths just naturally go down whatever happens in our life. And it just kind of happens that people start talking to me about sex and people are comfortable talking to me in general. I mean, I think most therapists feel that way. But whenever people started talking about sex, I went, oh, this is so much fun, but I don't have any training in this.
Sure.
You know, most grad schools don't offer any education in sex therapy. And so I went and I said, okay, I want to do this, but I definitely want to get the appropriate training in order to be doing it successfully and effectively. And so that's why I sought out AASECT, the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and wanted to get more training and become a certified sex therapist, which I'm almost there.
Yay! I'm so excited for you.
Yes.
Also, like we were saying before we got on the line, Florida makes it hella hard to do pretty much everything. So most people here don't. But the flip side of that is that we actually do get training in grad school on it. So I don't know what sense that makes. Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, you have to have a course in sex therapy before you can get your license. So some people from Alabama actually come across the border to take it here.
Nice.
Yeah. It's weird like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely schools that offer a course in sex therapy, but again, that's just a course. That's not really enough because, I mean, after going through all this training, the one thing you come out knowing is that you really don't know anything.
I find that true of a lot of areas of life, but especially human sexuality.
Sex, yes.
Yeah. So what has stood out to you the most about some of the couples that you work with? Because you work with a broad spectrum. That's one of the things I love about you.
Oh, thank you. Yes. That's a really fun part about my job is I get to see so many different types of couples and individuals that are struggling working with so many different variations of their own sexual exploration. And so I see couples that, are in a no sex or low sex marriage. So they haven't had sex in 10 years, or maybe it's an unconsummated marriage. They haven't had intercourse yet. And then I see folks on the whole other end of the continuum that are polyamorous, or they're kinky, or they, have a swinging relationship. And so it's such a big variety of people. I never get bored.
Right? I love my job for that. I cannot come home and ever claim that I was bored.
Right. It's always a new day.
No, truly. And I often say, like, if these walls could talk, which they can't because of HIPAA, but the stories, certainly some of the common themes, though, that we talk about make people's jaws drop. Just, what? Yeah. You wanted to do what?
Right. And that's okay.
and that's wonderful, as long as you find someone else that is cool with that and maybe enjoys that too. Right. That's the goal.
Right.
So you mentioned you work with people who haven't even consummated their marriage. Is that due to vaginismus and dyspareunia or something else?
Some of it's due to that. Other parts of it is due to religion and their own kind of upbringing and fear around sexuality and fear around pregnancy. So it's a combination. I think that they're all intertwined.
Wow. Even after they've made it official, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which brings up a really good point. As clinicians, and this is something that I'm personally passionate about, is bridging that gap between spiritual worldviews and sexuality. How do you find a good way of managing that delicate balance as a clinician between helping clients who, as you say, may come out of very dogmatic religious backgrounds and it's causing them pain at this point, and yet you don't want to, shit on their beliefs? Like, how do you personally manage that, Heather?
That's a really good question. And by the way, I love that you're doing this podcast. I love that you work with sexuality and spirituality, because that's something that is just not talked about enough. And I think that's kind of that's where we need to go. That's the discussions that we need to start having. Because
I always say, like, across the board, whether you're an atheist, you still have a spiritual worldview that's informing your sex life, and vice versa. So
yeah. I mean, I think it's helpful to learn about different religions and have kind of a basic understanding of it. But I think more so, the same principles that we come into learning whenever we start learning how to be a therapist can apply, right? That unconditional positive regard, the openness, the non-judgmental attitude that you need to have applies to working with all issues, and especially whenever you're working with religious and spirituality issues.
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that, because I think it is so healing. I think the healing process actually begins when someone is able to, even on the intake, I'm like, hey, I know we just met, but let's talk about your dick. It's fine. When they're able to admit some things that they may have perhaps felt shame around or hesitancy, and they can see on your face that you're totally okay with it and are open to dialoguing around it with them. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So you also, I'm super excited. I'm about to push all the buttons for a lot of these listeners. You happen to be the CEO of is it the Southwest Sexual Alliance?
It started out as a Southwest Sexual Health Alliance, and now we have 2 regions. So we have the Sexual Health Alliance, and that includes the regions of the Southwest and then the Great Lakes. So we have the Southwest Sexual Health Alliance and the Great Lakes Sexual Health Alliance now.
Excellent. And I saw a post from one of yours that made me come running to your email and said, oh, Heather, please let's chat about this, about AASECT saying that they don't personally believe in sexual addictions anymore.
Right. It's more complicated than that. But
I agree, but I'm boiling it down on purpose. Yeah. And I'm hoping that you'll expound upon that because it's a huge hot button issue.
Right. Yeah. So AASECT recently issued a public statement discussing the issue with the concept of sex addiction. And what that means is that we need to do a lot more research and a lot more studies before we can say that sex addiction is a appropriate diagnosis.
Amen. Now, can you explain for people who are like, why is this even a thing? Why does that matter? Why are people getting their panties in a bunch about this?
Well, in one of the questions that you put in your email, you had said, does sex addiction really exist? And, I think that a question is, do aliens exist? Right?
Right. I know.
It's a big area of discussion. A better way to frame the question is to explore why certain people have difficulty controlling their sexual behaviors while others do not. Then that helps us identify effective strategies to address the various causal factors. So,
right.
Yeah. So when we focus on sex, it's too much attention on the symptoms. And that's important because there's a lot of different reasons that people might report difficulties with sexual control. Sometimes it's an excuse. Other times it's a conflict between a person's sexual interests and their religious values. And other times it's relationship conflict over sex. And treatment should be different in all of those different cases.
So, Heather, I completely agree with you. And the reason that I personally find this so important is because I work with a lot of couples as well, where the second that word addiction gets thrown out, number one, whoever it's being thrown at tends to get hella defensive for obvious reasons. And the partner who has been reading on the interwebs, whatever he or she happened to come across, is usually understandably also freaked out at this idea because and I'm just owning my own biases, people, don't send me hate mail. When you label something as an addiction, it puts the stigma in our head that it's going to be difficult or nearly impossible to remove. So like the addictions model with like AA, for example, you may meet someone who hasn't touched alcohol in 50 years and they're still calling themselves an alcoholic. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of that, but when it comes to a relationship that there's always this inherent power dynamic in, I've seen couples that once that addict word is thrown out, it kind of becomes like this trump card that becomes a source of struggle for them continually.
Exactly.
And I don't know about you personally, but for me as well, I find that when it comes to sex, you alluded to this earlier, it is so individual. So what is a compulsive sexual behavior for one person, either in intensity or frequency, what the hell ever, may absolutely be somebody else's norm and not a problem.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And what defines it as a problem, right? Who defines it as a problem? And most often it's your therapist. Right?
So depending upon your therapist's worldview and how he or she grew up talking about your naughty bit, suddenly it's a problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
True story. And so even with taking it back to the top of the hour, that whole like sexual anorexia, when you meet a couple that's not having sex at all, it's really based on them as well. Because if you have two people who are together for companionship and don't find it a problem, then it's not a problem. We can't even diagnose that. But if you've got a couple who's gone from 3 days a week to suddenly they haven't touched each other in a year, that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's why they show up in our office, is because one partner is wanting sex more than the other.
Any instances, I guess it doesn't have to be specific, but like where you feel like there might be certain thresholds that clinicians should probably be paying attention to, or even partners listening to this?
What do you mean there's certain thresholds?
I was thinking along those lines of he's watching porn once a week and she's like, he's an addict because he's looked at porn. Or, but then again, I have, and I'll bring this back around, like I have met people who have done legit tissue damage to their genitals. So at that point, I'm pretty confident in saying we've got a compulsive behavioral issue. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I was kind of just wanting you to weigh in on it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think that in those issues, it's most often another mental health issue. And that's really one of the key components we need to discuss when we're talking about sex addiction, is that most often it means that there's some other coexisting mental health issues that have not been addressed. And so if someone is masturbating to porn and they're rubbing their genitals to the point of destruction, that does indicate a compulsivity or an impulsivity issue. Perfect.
So what are some of the common co-occurring disorders or issues? I hate to even use that word disorder, but co-occurring mental or emotional struggles that often pop up with sexual compulsivity that you've seen?
Oh man, the list is endless. I think that most often there's anxiety, there's depression, there's OCD. I think that a lot of the times it goes back to not having the appropriate sex education to begin with. And there's so much fear and shame around their own sexuality that is coming out in really destructive ways.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Definitely, at least in my private practice, anxiety is one of the biggest ones. And it's like, I tell my clients, we've all got our favorite flavor of Kool-Aid. And for you, this just happened to be the one that you chose to deal with your anxiety, So I may act out compulsively or impulsively and make myself feel better, right? That negative reinforcement cycle. But then I feel crappy about myself. So now I have to act out again, and around we go. And suddenly what used to not be a problem for me, yes, it's totally an issue for me. But it could just as easily be Oreos or Netflix.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And it's the shame that creates the cycle.
So true. So true. I read a study once talking about how it's the shame that drops us below that baseline that makes things okay. Like that's usually where, how do I want to put it? It's the thing that keeps the cycle flowing around and around.
Right.
So for people who don't have that, they seem to be able to step out of the compulsive cycle much easier. One of the studies was actually done on a Christian college. No shocker that it came across my feed that way. Christian college men at Wheaton, Illinois, and talking about compulsive masturbation. And what they found was exactly what you just said. It was this compounded effect of not having really adequate developmental sexual education. And then on top of that, religious stigma that made it more of an issue for the Christian college men than their peers. So I found that fascinating. And I'm sure incredibly frustrating for those still in that type of church worldview, because the higher rates of incidence of sexual issues are actually in the church, not outside of it.
Yep, exactly.
You're like, you preach to the choir. This is what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm not saying religion's bad. I'm just saying we should probably talk about sex a little bit more. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, religion can be a really meaningful and powerful thing in a lot of people's lives. I think that it's more about the connotations and the meaning that we give sex whenever we are in the church, right?
Yes.
We think that we have all these rules and ideas about what it should be. And some of that is our own. Some of that is, the people that you're listening to.
Absolutely. I interviewed Emma Schmidt. I don't know if you know her from online. She's a Christian sex therapist. And she was telling me how she somehow got partnered with this pastor, got who asked her to do like a series of talks, and she asked him, like, can I talk about toys? Can I talk about other things? And I am so impressed. This congregation of 30,000 people let her get up on stage and say words like pussy and penis. Like, I was like, man, I told her on the episode, I wish you'd had a GoPro strapped to your head, because that would have been an epic moment for me.
Totally would have been. That would have gone viral.
Yes.
Wow, what a cool church.
That's what I said. So we need more like that one for sure.
Yeah.
I'm glad you pointed out that it can be a source of support. So when I'm working with the LGBTQ plus, I don't know, the fabulous rainbow spectrum clients, some of them who have come out of, because we are in the United States, so Christianity is the predominant religion here. So they've come out of a perhaps incredibly dogmatic or rigid faith system. Oftentimes there is this struggle, I've noticed, with sexual identity and trying to integrate or just process through their religion. Have you experienced any of that?
Oh, absolutely. We're in the South.
True story.
We are in the South. I'm in Texas. I'm in Austin. And so, although Austin's pretty progressive, I was saying, in a previous conversation with you, that it's still Texas. And there's still a lot of religious people that go to church, that come into my office, and they have religious upbringings. And I myself am one of those people. And I think that that's part of why and how I can relate to them so well, is that, I grew up in a Methodist Christian home as well, very conservative. And, I think that to be able to explore how those values and those messages impact your sexual development and your sexuality with, your partner is a really important thing to discuss. To explore.
Absolutely. So I actually grew up Assemblies of God, which separated from the Methodists in 1914 in the church history. Serves me right. So I just feel like a kindred kinship to my Methodist brothers and sisters. Funny, we were just too feisty over that whole speaking in tongues thing. So that was the divisive factor, and I totally understand it. But I consider myself fortunate because my parents, while they are still incredibly dogmatic in other ways, and we don't completely see eye to eye on some other issues, perhaps like LGBT issues, they were, however, pretty open and progressive when it came to sex, at least between married partners.
Right. You can do it, but only if you're married.
Right. And they were open about it. Like, I would see my dad smack my mom on the ass, or like he'd give her a kiss, and like if we'd be like, ew, that's gross, they'd be like, it's fine, it's because we're married, and I hope you enjoy it someday. So at least I grew up thinking, okay, sex is cool, sex should be enjoyed by both partners. I at least had a good foundation,
right?
Which I think for me then sparked this interest when I looked around the church and noticed so many people were freaking struggling with their sex lives. And I was like, why? What is this? What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. In my congregation, it was, of course, no sex till marriage. And I think that, back to the beginning of the show, we talked about people who have unconsummated marriage. I think that oftentimes whenever you don't have intercourse before marriage, and then all of a sudden it's okay to have intercourse, a lot of the people that I talk to, it's kind of like, well, I've had all this anxiety up until marriage about intercourse, and now all of a sudden it's okay to have it, and I'm supposed to enjoy it. What?
Right. That is exactly what Emma said. That's too funny. And it mirrors mine too. So we have one of the biggest conservative Christian that's been full of scandal in the news. Sorry, world. Universities here in the area, Pensacola Christian College. And they're going to hate me, but I get a lot of their students actually who go through exactly just that. And so it's not at all uncommon for me to see vaginismus, dyspareunia, performance anxiety, you name it, premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, out of these, people that you would never think should have a problem, at least not from Hollywood. I mean, they're not even 25 yet. But it was exactly that. Like, I've been trying to put this on hold my entire life and not lust and not be okay with this. And all of a sudden I'm supposed to like light up for my husband and nobody told me how to do that.
I've been working against it the whole time.
So what is some of the first conversations that you would have with a couple like that? Because that really does bridge the gap between sex and spirit.
That's a really good question. I think that whenever I sit down with a couple that has expressed generally that's what's going on, first normalize it, right?
Yes.
That is completely understandable, and part of what we need to do is just get comfortable talking about sex.
Yeah. Yep.
Because whenever we spent our whole life avoiding it and not thinking about it, and that's a bad thing. We're not supposed to do it. We're not supposed to think about it. We're not supposed to lust after it. And now all of a sudden it's okay to do that, and we're supposed to be talking about it. It's really uncomfortable at first.
Yeah,
because we haven't done it.
And exactly. And depending upon your worldview, certain words just don't feel safe, and it just feels naughty or dirty, which ironically, that shame thing we keep talking about can make any potential sexual struggle 10 times worse.
Right.
Because it's almost like the brain works against us sometime with its, focus on novelty and taboo. So
yeah. And that exactly goes back to sex addiction, right? Whenever we fight against it and struggle against it and, have that piece of us that we don't accept, and there's so much shame and fear around it, that makes for a really difficult model to actually form healthy opinions and have healthy conversations around it.
It is hard for me to be open with someone when I know that they're looking at me like an addict.
Right.
For sure.
Right.
So what would you say then to clinicians that are afraid that we just opened up the floodgates? Like it's just going to be like a Tiger Woods cop-out for everything. Like the goats are now in danger, the teenagers are in danger. Like, hide your kids, hide your wife, because the sex therapists have said there's no such thing as an addiction. So anything goes.
Well, I think that goes back to whenever we fear something so strongly, we tend to look at it in black and white thinking, right? It's either all or nothing. And to kind of like go down that rabbit hole is really a disservice to people that actually are struggling with it and actually do need help. And they need help in a way that isn't going to shame them and isn't going to pathologize their sexuality, help in a way that, is going to help them accept those pieces of themselves and integrate them in a healthy way.
Brilliant. I think that's exactly the key there, is that the thought is from this AASECT ruling and the rest of the clinicians that don't really necessarily buy into the 12-step model as it pertains to sex in this way, is that by normalizing it, it's not necessarily saying that this behavior is not distressful or dysfunctional. It's not necessarily saying that it doesn't need to be treated. It's providing open lines of dialogue. And as you very well pointed out, we are still doing more research on it and need to continue doing more research on it.
Right, exactly. And I think that what we have found is that whenever we treat people from a sex addiction model, it ends up not working. It's not effective. And I think that that's the piece that we do know. And so that's why we need other models that, reduce shame and reduce fear and don't pathologize the behavior and look at the other mental health issues that might be happening that are contributing to their struggle.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the biggest struggles that first woke me up to sexual compulsivity is way back in grad school for one of our addictions classes. We were told to attend a 12-step of our choice. And so, of course, I chose an SAA meeting, a Sex Addicts Anonymous. And there were none in this area. And the ones that were here were only for men. So I drove my little booty to Montgomery, Alabama, 6 hours away. Dragged my sister, who's a social worker, and she made us go under fake names. And because they were so skeptical about letting us in. And it was a room full of men, and the men were,
of course,
even though, of course, right? Because again, it's not normalized. So even though it said it was an open meeting and they knew we were coming, I can understand this. They gave them an opportunity to see if they were comfortable or not, and most of them were not. So the leader and the associate leader took my sister and I into the next room, and it was very heartbreaking and enlightening conversation, listening to stories like this one man had been with over 400 women, 15 men, and 15 dogs. And the conversation isn't about labeling any of those behaviors necessarily as wrong, but to say that for him, he was definitely in distress. He was married and, wanted to stay married. And his wife, like most wives, was not cool with this because he'd gone through prostitutes and a lot of secretaries. And there was definitely, for me seeing this, a compulsive nature to it. So he labeled it an addiction. However, he'd been at this SAA thing for over a decade and was still on a daily struggling against it. And the point that I really wanted to drive home was that unlike other quote unquote addictions, you don't have to, have alcohol to survive. However, humans are hardwired to want to have sex. Like it's like this innate thing. And so he was talking about I can't just leave my genitals at home. Like that would make things so much easier. Mm-hmm. But literally our society, our culture, we are inundated with triggers, all day long. And I'm not at all saying that sex is harder than alcohol. So don't send me hate mail on that. But my point being about normalizing it for people rather than pathologizing it, recognizing that there is this innate drive, even from a psychological standpoint, from Freud on, to want to mate, to want to, have this pleasurable release. And once that becomes somehow, quote unquote, twisted for someone, it can be very damaging to the psyche to, have that shame factor. Like here we are sitting in a little tiny back room, you know what I mean? Having to use fake names because nobody wanted to talk to us about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to say about everything that you just said.
I know that was a big story.
Yeah, no, and I think that the piece that just sticks out to me is just the shame, not being able to kind of be open with your sexuality and not be able to express it in a way that feels good to you and the other people around you.
And all of the men in there felt very hopeless. And so most of them had therapists because SAA, that's one thing that I will say they do pretty well, is they always recommend having an outside therapist, but they're able to determine their own quote unquote sobriety and what that means for them. So hearing these men's story, it was literally about trying to manage an addiction rather than feeling like they had agency and healing that was possible.
Right. I think that, part of this is a part of why the sex addiction myth that is so dangerous. This is a part of the sex addiction myth that is so dangerous.
That's why I brought it up.
Yes, sex addiction tells people that sexual desire is a destructive, a weakening thing, that only men can control their sexual desire, to excise it and ring it with fear and prohibition, and that this needs to stop. You need to stop this behavior. And I think that part of what we're talking about is that doesn't work.
Right.
As evidenced by the person that's in treatment for 10 years. There's lots of reasons why that doesn't work, but part of it is that, part of what sex addiction does is that you take away the responsibility, that you have responsibility over your sexual health, and that you can learn how to have a healthy sexual life through education and work.
Yes. Beautiful. So what would you say to listeners as we start to wrap up who perhaps are concerned about their own sexual behavior, or who are looking for a therapist who isn't going to shame them? Like, where should they start?
Well, I think that looking for a sex positive therapist could be a good idea. someone who has training in sex therapy, and perhaps someone who has gone through and become certified by AASECT, which is, of course, the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. They have a really rigid standards for certification. I think that most importantly is just being able to have a conversation with a therapist by phone. Most therapists offer free phone consultations. So being able to have a conversation, asking them about how they view sexuality. And I think from those answers, you'll be able to glean a lot about their own personal values. I mean, I think that's the key part here, is that, therapists are trained to think about their own biases and everything else except sex.
So true. What's up with that?
And that's why I started the Sexual Health Alliance. That's why my colleague and I, Dylan, started the Southwest Sexual Health Alliance first, was that, we don't have training for sexual health issues as general therapists. General therapists get little to no education in it. And so we need to be able to offer that access, not only to sex therapy education, but to accurate, high quality sexual health education, because as you well know, there's lots of misinformation out there, and lots of, sex therapists or even sex addiction therapists that don't have any training in sexuality. I mean, that's part of a lot of the things that kind of where people get in trouble, is that you can go to a sex addiction therapist and they have no training in sexuality. It's only training in the addiction model. And I think they're changing that, but I think that's a huge issue.
I agree. There needs to be more on the whole multifacets of the broad spectrum of human sexuality. And I am so excited that you and your program exists. And I am currently signed up and super excited about the upcoming webinar series. Yay! I'm always looking for, because as a clinician like me, who is sex positive, who is kink positive, who is poly, whatever, all of things positive, I'm trying to find anything, even for, the listeners now, trying to find, books for them and web pages for them is so tough at times.
Oh, absolutely. Because there's so much crap out there. There's so much misinformation out there.
Or it's like just from one narrative and not at all non-pathologizing. So
right. And
we're working on it, people.
The webinar series you're talking about is the Sexceptional webinar series with Dr. David Lay. And Dr. David Lay is one of the first people to write about the sex addiction myth, actually, in the Sex Addiction Myth, the book that was published in 2012. And so, his recent book was Ethical Porn for Dicks, which is also really fun.
I ordered it, and that's the one I'm most looking forward to. Just saying the title is fun. People are like, what?
Well, it's encouraging men to have responsible porn use, right? And so it's a really great book. I highly
That's a hot button, too. That'll have to be a Podversation for a whole another day.
Absolutely.
Heather, where can people find you?
So you can find me at sexualhealthalliance.com or respark.co. So like a spark of lightning, and you put RE in front of it, respark.co, because that's the cool thing, apparently. And .com was taken.
I love that. And the fact that you call the whole series Sexceptional.
Oh, yes.
That is just titillating on so many levels.
Yeah,
love it.
Well, it came out of this Exceptional lecture series that we started, and that's the programming that's in, all of the Southwest, and in Houston, Dallas are about to launch, and then also in the Great Lakes and Chicago. And those are for the community, for in-person events that are super fun, and they give, all therapists, clinicians, medical providers, and, all of the other populations that deal with sexual health issues. So body workers and acupuncturists, sexual surrogates, and anyone who sits with a client and talks about sex, or sits with someone and talks about sex, we want them to have access to high quality sex education. And so that's what this Exceptional lecture series is for.
I am so excited about this. My little Methodist chica with all the flags flying. I love this.
Yeah.
There's another anomaly out there. It's beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So for those of you in the local area, you should definitely check that out. Because if I were, I would be. But Austin's a long drive from Pensacola, so
well, maybe we'll be in Florida soon.
Yeah, come on over. The water's great for sure.
Yeah.
Heather, thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Undressing the Spirit podcast. I pray you found some inspiration and titillation today. As always, I am forever grateful for 5-star reviews, comments, and subscriptions on iTunes and anywhere else you may be listening to this broadcast. Please note the information provided is not meant to convey professional, psychological, or medical advice. If you could use such services, I highly recommend seeking them out from someone you trust. To get in touch with me personally, please check out ariatherapy.com or talesfromatrapezoid.com. Until next time, everyone.